Everyone. So welcome to our CFPR weekly seminar series. So my name is Senhu Wang. I'm from the Sociology department. So today is our great honor and a pleasure to have Professor Leah RUPPANNER from University of Melbourne to give us interesting talk. So before we get started, let me briefly introduce our speaker. And so our speaker is Leah RUPPANNER. She is a professor of sociology and a founding director of Future of Work Lab at the University of Melbourne. And she was previously a director of the Policy Lab at the University of Melbourne as well. And her research interests include gender studies and its intersections to social inequalities, technologies, and policies. And she is also a leading expert on COVID-19 and its impact on gender inequality in US and Australia. And her research has been published in many top journals, including Demography, Journal of Marriage and Family, European Sociological Review, Social Science Research, and so on. And her research has also been widely reported by many mainstream media over the world, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Guardian, and so on. And her presentation topic today is changes in work care under the COVID-19 and the implications for the recovery. Yeah, so we're very looking forward to this presentation. And Professor RUPPANNER, please. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for including me. As I mentioned previously, I have been to Singapore before, a beautiful country, wonderful place to be. So very honored to be invited back to give this talk. I'm going to do something a little bit controversial today because it's COVID-19, post-COVID-19, and we can do what we want, right? The world has changed, the rules have changed. And I'm going to walk you through kind of the breadth of research we've done looking at women and parents' experience under COVID across our articles. Everything I'm about to show you today has been published. So I'm going to work through it a little bit more quickly than a single article. But if you have questions about the methods, the way we code our variables, it's all published research, so you can access it there. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I have an incredible team of co-authors on this project. Katie Collins at Washington University in St. Louis, Liana Kristen-Landivar at the Women's Bureau, and William Scarborough at University of North Texas. So what I'm presenting today is not just my work, but it's really the work of an incredibly powerful, incredibly impressive team of researchers. So I'm going to talk to you about what we know. I'm going to say some obvious things, and I'll give you some detail. We know that COVID-19 disproportionately impacted women's employment. We know that they're in the jobs that had higher job loss, they had a slower recovery, they were in the industries hardest hit by the pandemic, and that they took on all of that childcare and housework that came home in light of school closures. And the pandemic was what was called a she-cession, so distinct from other economic recessions. But this is just to give you some kind of a context of what happened in the US specifically, was that actually 2021, post-2021, women's employment was basically at 1987 levels. And even though we have seen some kind of movement of women's reentry into the labor market, that it is still below levels that it was pre-pandemic. So there's an incredible loss of women's labor force capacity in response to the COVID-19 pandemic that was not just short-term, but was also long-term. We also know from existing research that women are more likely to scale out when they have kids. Mothers are more likely to scale out. They're more likely to take on more of the childcare and housework once kids hit the scene, and that any of these gaps in employment can have long-term consequences for financial health and economic well-being. So along this context, there's this big question of what did COVID-19 mean for parents? Was this going to be a gender revolution? Or was it going to be a moment of widening gender gaps? And that was one of the critical questions that started off at the pandemic. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Cool. And am I going too fast? Saying I can see you, so just give me a all good.
No, it's very good, yeah.
Okay, cool. Just give me a like this if I start to dip out or go too slow. So it was during this period of time that we published our first article asking what was happening to parents' employment specifically. To give you a little bit of context, I think you can see my mouse. I'm giving US restaurant bookings, but we were taking this period of time right before the pandemic started and this period where everything shut down. This is my illustrative example, but we all lived through this. And there was a period of time where everything went closed largely in part because we didn't know what the pandemic was going to do. So we're taking this period of time, we're taking data from the US panel data from the US current population survey. We restricted it to dual earner married heterosexual couples, and we took February to April 2020 in that widespread period of closure. We're applying person level fixed effects model. What we found was effectively that during this kind of initial phase, from February to April, that we saw mothers with little kids dropped their work time. Those with, sorry, I just have to move this. This is changes in work hours, spent less time in work. Those with older kids spent less time in work too, and really mothers were kind of getting pummeled in terms of work time during the start of the pandemic. If we look at this actually as a graph, we know that mothers spend less time in work on average than fathers, but what we can see is that the gender gap widened during this period of time, and in particular amongst those with the littlest kids in the home, those with preschool aged and school-aged kids. One of our critical questions was, what happens in those couples where everyone could telecommute, where both had access to telecommuting? And what we found was that was actually a really essential resource for mothers and fathers with kids that were school aged or older, right? These are the school age kids. But those with the littlest babies in the home, mothers were the ones who took the brunt of the pandemic employment loss in their work hours, even when both partners, so these are heterosexual couples where both could telecommute, that when the little kids were in the home, the mother's work hours reduced. And this is just giving you, again, that graphically. I know I'm moving a little quickly, but as I said, everything's published. So feel free to access you can access the articles there. So what we were finding kind of at the start of the pandemic was that the gender gap in work hours was growing in the US from 20 to 50% from February to April. That telecommuting was this critical resource to buffering mothers' more extensive job losses from daycare closures, but that even those with the little kids, if you could telecommute, it was a resource, but not for those with babies in the house. Okay, let me just see. Okay. Next kind of question was, what does this mean for married couples with and without kids? We did a little data visualization in Sociology. Look at that, taking that same group, but now looking at married heterosexual couples from February to April, same data. And we just kind of looked at what was happening in terms of labor participation pages. What I just want you to see from this basically is that we see everyone had a change in labor force participation. Men without kids and men with little kids, there was a reduction in work hours. It was most severely felt by those women with school-age kids. We see the same reduction in work hours too. So there was an incredible job loss during this period of time. But what we're seeing is that unemployment was disproportionately buffered or absorbed by mothers at this period of time. And that is something I think that's quite critical. Yes, those without kids had high unemployment rates, and so did those with little kids. So this was really a pandemic that knocked at the start women out of employment, and mothers in particular. I won't go over this, but I'll just give the last kind of takeaway lines. We see this reduction in employment. We saw that fathers also exited employment, but their rates were 1 to 2 percentage points lower. And what that meant was 250,000 more mothers and fathers with little kids left employment. I'm going to move a little quickly because I have so much more to tell you. One of the things we were then interested in is what is driving it. Okay, start of the pandemic, we know that actually mothers are getting pummeled in terms of their employment, what's driving their labor market exits. And we thought that the critical thing was whether schools were open or not, in particular for those with kids who were school aged in the house. So we started collecting data on school operating status. We have it at 2 time points. It's publicly available and accessible, funded by the Russell Sage Foundation. It's there. I'll give you the link at the end. So if you ever want to use it, we're happy for you to have it, use it, apply it. And one of the things that was interesting is that I wrote a book. Have you read it? Do you want to buy it? You should. But I wrote a book pre-pandemic. And one of the things I was really interested in was, how is it that states, we often think of the US as kind of the singular welfare state in which childcare policies, but really actually if you live in California versus you live in Florida versus you live in New York, it's a very different culture. And I was interested in and documented pre-pandemic how childcare resources and maternal employment and access to women's higher education varied across states. And I found this really interesting clustering. And one of the things I just want you to know is pre-pandemic, I found that these West Coast states we think are very progressive were actually very hostile to working mothers. They had very few resources, and they were not actually a very conducive place to live if you were a mother. I want you to watch what happens to school closures, just keeping in mind these states. So we started collecting the most comprehensive data set on school operating status. We have 9,000 districts for all 50 states, and we have it at 2 time periods. At the time of this publication in Gender and Society, we only had actually data for a handful of the states. And so what I'm going to show you now is just kind of what we were showing with the handful of groups. So we aggregated the school district data to the state level. We weighted it by student population size, and then we merged it with the current population survey. And what we're interested in doing is comparing mothers in employment pre-pandemic 2019 to those during that kind of start of the pandemic for those with school-age kids in the house. If we look at these 3 case studies of Maryland, where schools went fully remote, and New York, in which they were hybrid, and Texas, where they were majority face-to-face, and then we link it to maternal employment, what we found was probably what you'd expect to find. State in which schools went fully remote, mothers' employment dropped by 16%. Fathers' employment had no significant difference, and we did not find the same reduction in mothers' work time, mothers' employment as in those states where schools were either open in hybrid mode or in person. The school closure was really a detrimental thing for mothers' employment. When we pooled the states we had, we found a similar pattern. I have to move you all on the Zoom. Give me 1 second. And comparing this, what we found was those states where there were primarily remote, that mothers' employment dropped. But in those states in which it was primarily in person or hybrid, we saw no change in mothers' employment during the pandemic. And this came out in Gender Society, kind of start of the mid-pandemic era. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but just that's kind of our main conclusions. Of course, I'm giving you this kind of overview when we had the first wave of the data. We've subsequently, as I said, collected the first additional waves, and it's complete. We have 25 million elementary school students across the US, and we publish these data in demography to show you what's going on in general in terms of employment. So who's in our ESF, who's in our data and who's not? We basically have 98% of the entire total elementary school students in the US. These the groups that we're missing, although we're missing 28% of the districts, these are really the rural and small districts. There's schools that have fewer than 500 students in their classrooms. And this is why, even though we have, this is higher, we're getting almost all the elementary school students in the US, just graphing it on average. All right, I just want to tell you how we got the data because it was quite impressive. Because none of this was published, because no government agency was actually collecting it, what we were doing was going actually all around at the district level to see what was happening. We were going to Facebook pages. We felt like we were kind of creepy because we were leering and lurking into all of the schools reporting about were they open, were they not. We were going into their district websites, but it was quite a heavy lift in terms of data collection. And again, I'm just going to say this, we have 2 waves. So one in September 30th, 2020, and then a second wave coming in April. So getting that fall semester and then spring semester in the US public school system. If we look at this at the state level, and remember I said to you, think about that book, and I told you that the West Coast states were actually hostile to women, and hostile to working mothers. We can see that this kind of rose color are those states that went fully remote. And this is the West Coast, which kind of patterns in similar ways to my book. In person with more of the modal category coming through the center of the US. And then we see more of this remote right here. And then these are the states that were hybrid, option to have your kids in school physically and at home, that combination. When we look at the district level, what we can see was the modal. So this is again in the first semester that 56% of all districts were in person, but that captured 38% of the students. So most students in the US, this is again district level variation as opposed to state level, were in some sort of remote learning in that first wave. So of all the students, 38% were in person, 17% were in hybrid, and 45% were in fully remote learning, with the variability across. You can see even within some of these states like Florida, you see a lot of this is actually in-person learning with the exception of Miami-Dade County. which has gone remote. So you can get the within-state variation and the across-country variation. I'll keep that. What does that mean for mothers' employment? Here's the gender gap in 2019. We can see if schools were in person, 100%, no change in the gender gap in labor force participation of mothers relative to fathers. So if it stayed in person, no change. But as the number of days increased of remote learning, we can see that mothers' employment decreased. So 1 day of in-person learning predicts about an increase of 1 percentage point in the probability of mothers' employment to fathers. So we're seeing that kind of reduction over time. We were interested in whether mothers' employment relative to non-mothers, right? Is this actually just a gender effect? Or is this a consequence of something distinct to parents? And we're finding kind of a reduction of it. Yes, women were getting knocked out of employment. And yes, women in states with more remote learning where perhaps COVID restrictions were more severe were also less likely to be employed. But mothers had a distinct experience relative to those without children. So this was something that was specifically happening to mothers relative to fathers and mothers relative to women without children. I know I'm throwing a lot at you. Okay, we're also interested in what this looks like in terms of race. So this is the composition, racial composition of schools, which was one of our measure. And one of the things we found was that if the schools were predominantly white, 75% or more white students, they were pretty much in person. 68% of those schools had in-person learning. So white dominant schools had access to more in-person learning. Those that had higher concentrations of Black or Hispanic students were either in-person, 41%, so less likely to get access to in-person learning, 41%, with 58% having access to either hybrid or remote learning, and 62% of those with mostly Hispanic students. So white students had better access to in-person learning, and then Black and Hispanic students most of them were in either hybrid or remote learning. We are not education scholars, but this is what our data could do for those of you who are, is understand, and we have these measures compiled in that data set for you if you want to utilize them. What happened over time and who was most disadvantaged? And we'll have this come out in the next year from the Russell Sage Foundation. We were interested in what happened in spring, because of course, everything with the pandemic is like something happened yesterday, but tomorrow it's a whole new world. And so this is looking at those two data sets and then again, linking them to families with little kids in the home. Here's what it looks like in terms of school reopening. So this is fall. I've already shown you this one, and you can see the West Coast stays pretty much remote with this variability. Spring 2022 in the US, almost all of the schools were back open in person, except for most of the schools on the West Coast of the US, which were operating predominantly in a hybrid mode with some still in remote. Again, thinking about my book where I said these states were the most kind of hostile in terms of their access to resources to mothers. This is another perhaps example of that clustering where these are the states that really kept hybrid learning in place. And what we find is that, sorry, I won't harass you with this. Yeah, so thinking about that, what we found in terms of in-person learning or hybrid learning in the fall, we found that most of the schools that were, let's just do remote as a starting point. Most of the schools that were remote in fall 2020, they were urban. They had more Black or Hispanic students. I've already shown you that. And they were more left-leaning Democrat voting. By spring, very few were in fully remote learning, but the ones that were, the 2.1%, kind of showed that same pattern. They tended to be more urban. They tended to have higher concentrations of Black and Hispanic students, and they were significantly more Democratic voting. Of course, these states did have higher concentrations of, yeah, okay. I'm just going to move on. So when we looked at this and linking it to mothers' employment, what we found, we were really interested in now unpacking a little bit of mothers' employment at a higher level. We still found that remote learning was associated with mothers' reduced employment relative to fathers and women without children. Where we found the greatest reductions were happening, however, were amongst those with less education. So those with a high school or less educated mothers were 6 percentage points less likely they were reducing employment by 6 percentage points. And that's effectively wiping out 16 years of employment progress. So that school closure had a disproportionate impact on mothers. It had a disproportionate impact on mothers with less education. We found that reduced employment amongst Black and Hispanic mothers relative to Black and Hispanic mothers without children. So of course, Black and Hispanic mothers have historically higher rates of employment than do white mothers. So if we're looking within race rather than across race, they reduced employment at higher rates than those without children. And we also were finding that single mothers were being impacted by these school closures at more, sorry, let me say that a different way. We're being more severely impacted. So women with less education, Black and Hispanic women, mothers relative to those without children, and then single mothers. We also found that if you had reduced employment from fall 2020, that there was a scarring effect into spring 2021. So those school closures, even though it was 6 months prior, that it still had this lingering effect on mothers' employment into the spring, even when for many the schools opened. Okay, I'm gonna pause. I know I'm moving quickly, but I think, are we all still feeling good? How's our energy level? Everyone happy? Okay, I'll keep going. So one of the other things we were interested in doing is thinking about, the US is not the center of the world. There are other countries out there that have interesting things going on. And so we were interested in comparing the US relative to Australia. We have 2 articles that came out on this, in part we collected our own data on over 1,000 respondents from the YouGov panels in each country. And we have 3 waves. We have 4 waves, but I haven't updated the slide. We caught them in May 2020, start of the pandemic, September 2020, same year. We got them 1 year later in June 2021, and we're back in the field right now to get them again in June 2022. So we have a longitudinal panel. We have 600 of them are pretty much the longitudinal panel within that 1,000 across 2 countries. At the start of the pandemic, we were really interested in what was happening in terms of stress, strain, and financial outcomes. What we were finding from our studies, and again, they're here, was that in May 2020, that started that pandemic, US respondents were really feeling the severe impact of changes in their financial circumstances. And all of that financial worry was really creating an incredible amount of emotional strain. But in particular, mothers in the US, not necessarily mothers in Australia, were feeling the most anxious and financially worried about employment and domestic changes. So they were being saddled and sandwiched by changing employment circumstances and financial circumstances and their domestic circumstances. And the result of that is relative to US fathers and Australian mothers and fathers, they were feeling the most stressed by everything that was going on. So this really was at the start of the pandemic of mothers. By September 2020, we were interested in looking at what was happening to changes in their employment and changes in their work stuff. One of the interesting things we found happening was that this is a proportion reporting job changes. They lost their job or had their pay hours cut. We were seeing this is Australia, this is the US. Sorry, I just gotta move you around. And these are, I don't have my things there. Oh, sorry, I do. These are fathers and these are mothers. So we saw in May, in Australia, about 35%, pretty equal variation in employment loss. By September, it was still pretty high, with fathers slightly higher. In the US, our sample, and this is just our sample, we saw that mothers experienced more of an employment loss than fathers, but by September, there was a greater recovery. I just want to remind you that in Australia, it has some of the harshest, strictest lockdowns in the world. You all might be close on this to us. And so there really was this concerted effort to keep people in their homes and stop the spread. And so the fact that there was kind of this lingering unemployment loss or job loss, whereas in the US, there was really a push to reopen the economies, right? Will show that this is significantly different. In terms of housework and childcare, we saw that in May, Australian mothers picked up more. This is childcare and housework relative to their previous. This is an increase in relative to pre-pandemic levels as opposed to time change. So I am doing more than I did pre-pandemic as opposed to I'm spending 2 hours more. I'm spending 2 hours. So that Australian mothers picked up more in housework and childcare, housework at the start of the pandemic. But what was interesting from the sample is once you look at these Australian fathers, they picked up more housework, they picked up more childcare than did their US counterparts in May, and they held it for a longer period of time. So more of them held higher housework and childcare into September. Same for child, sorry, this is housework, and same for childcare. These Australian fathers held greater loads from May to September, whereas in the US, there was kind of this reversion back to traditional divisions. US mothers held more, but US fathers took some more at the start and then reverted back. Pandemic, they reverted back, more of them reverted back by September. The reason I'm telling you this is we're interested in what this would do for their mental health. And we found that for Australian fathers who were picking up more of the housework, they suffered as a result of that. So they reported, this is our Australian fathers, if they had their job cut or their pay hours reduced, they were more anxious. So they had more restless sleep and they were less calm. The job loss disrupted their kind of emotional state, but so did their greater housework demands and childcare. If they picked up more housework and they picked up more childcare, they're also more anxious and they slept worse. Australian mothers, the only thing that made them more anxious was if they did more childcare. They were more anxiety and slept worse. In the US, the only thing that was disrupting US fathers' anxiety and sleep was whether they had their job hours cut. So, sorry, I know they had their job hours cut. That was the thing that mattered. It didn't matter whether they did more. But for US mothers, it was this combination of job hours cut and increased housework. So Australian fathers picked up more housework and they picked up more childcare and they had their jobs lost and they suffered emotionally. And they actually look more similar to US mothers than they do to anybody else. So one of the arguments we made, it was like for the first time, they kind of had that experience of work-family strain that often mothers carry. And once they did that, they suffered as a result. So, but US fathers, the only thing that mattered was if they had this employment disruption. We're arguing that there's a kind of this shift towards traditionalization. I'll tell you, I just summarized this, but I'll tell you that we've subsequently collected additional data. And one of the interesting things we found is the Australian fathers are holding on to it even longer. They held on to that greater housework and childcare. And so there's this big question of, is this like a restructure of gender norms in the home? I'll tell you, our data does not show that for the US. For the US, it was like this reversion back to traditionalization. And there's this reversion back to traditionalization. Which is perhaps not that surprising relative to things other people have said. But in Australia, there might be this movement towards greater gender equality. There might be. We have to see over time, but so far our data is suggesting, that there is this movement towards that. Okay, now, I know I've thrown a lot at you. I know you're 30 minutes in, you're trying to figure out, when can I take a break? Is this almost over? How do I relax? Don't worry. I'll summarize it for you. So taking right now, looking across our studies, what I want you to understand is that the pandemic has not equalized gender relations. Our evidence from across all of these studies is that it disadvantaged mothers. We're showing that American mothers, US mothers are knocked out of employment at higher rates than fathers, and their mental health has been impacted by unstable employment and larger domestic loads. So those two things were really detrimental to US mothers. We also show that these experiences vary across US states, that living in a state like California versus living in, say, a state like Florida versus living really actually mattered in terms of their employment experiences. So the context mattered significantly. much in the way in which we might think about context mattering in terms of which country you lived in. Did it matter if you lived in Australia versus Singapore versus the UK? That actually, it mattered in the US whether you lived in California versus Idaho versus Nebraska. In Australia, we show some evidence from our data that mothers experienced kind of a mental health penalty around the employment, but we also are showing that fathers stepped in ways that US fathers did not. And the result of that is that they suffered emotionally. And I already said this, but is there an indication whether we have some evidence that Australia is well positioned for a restructure of their gender roles, whereas the US, it looks like there was perhaps a re-intensification. Because I can't leave you on a negative note. One of the questions is, what are the policy solutions? We know this, here we are, now what do we do? Sorry, we wrote an article about this. So at the start of the pandemic, we're really interested in what are kind of some policy advice we can give to governments who are grappling with major issues. And we published this in Family Relations. And one of the things we're interested in doing is looking at the recession. How do we understand what could happen in other times of incredible economic precarity? And we were particularly interested in Head Start. So in the US, Head Start is the childcare program that's offered to low-income families. So you have to be below a certain threshold. Not everyone gets it. It's a federal program below an income threshold, and it's kind of zero as childcare / preschool. Provided by the federal government, provided by providers within the state, but funded by the federal government. So we were interested in taking the American Community Survey from 2006 to 2016, and we're looking at state level measures of Head Start enrollment. We restricted it to all families with children under the age of 5. We had about 1.5 million families across all states, and we applied growth models. This comes through my book too. So even though Head Start is a federally available program, meaning that every kid under a certain income threshold should be able to access Head Start, this is not how it looks across states. So if you live in a state like North Dakota or South Dakota, almost all of the eligible children get access to Head Start. But if you live in a state like Nevada, only 22%, or Idaho, only 29%. So even though there's this federal program that's supposed to add this benchmark and bring everybody up, there's significant variability in its application across states. Our question was, what happened if you were in a state with this kind of childcare resource during the recession? So this little shaded area from 2008 to 2009 is the period of the recession. And what you can see is here are 100% of those eligible students are enrolled. Even though that states where there were more kids in Head Start had higher rates of poverty pre the economic recession, they were much more likely, they had flatter curves and ended up actually in a slightly or better spot by 2016 in terms of the percentage of families living below poverty thresholds with little kids. This is a flatter line. In those states in which only 20% of those eligible kids had access to Head Start or had access to childcare, you see a much more significant increase in family poverty. So Head Start proved to be kind of a pretty effective buffer. One buffer to help parents re-enter employment is giving them childcare, especially in times of economic crisis. If you look across certain states that are very similar to each other culturally, but very different in terms of their enrollment, you can see that a state like Mississippi versus a state like Alabama, in Mississippi, 90% of all eligible children are enrolled in Head Start. Yes, higher peaks, but in the end, quicker declines in terms of this. Alabama, you see a sharper rise in poverty amongst families over time, and then they kind of end up in the same spot. Same if you take a state like Arkansas, where there's only 46% enrolled, or a state like Oklahoma. So we often think these are really conservative states. They actually have very limited resources, but Head Start is a critical resource, and this came through my book too. Childcare, this will shock everybody in the room. Childcare is a critical resource for parents' employment. And what's interesting is in times of crisis, the expansion of childcare from a federal or a policy perspective absolutely helped parents maintain employment. So Here's what I'm just going to close. States with higher rates of Head Start enrollment had a smaller increase in family poverty during the Great Recession. They had a more stable recovery than those with lower access to Head Start. And our key argument was that actually expanding childcare, Jill Yavarsky and I have an article that I love that just came out, making the argument for universal high quality, accessible childcare. It's such a critical resource for parents' employment. There's so much evidence around this, and we were showing it's actually quite effective in terms of policy. Sorry, there's an economic value to that as well. And we argue that you should expand, the federal government should expand this. My last thing I'm going to say, and then I promise I'm done. You didn't think I could do all these slides in such a short period of time, is that one of the conclusions I want to make is just that it really actually matters. States have in the US in particular, states have very different institutional childcare structures, and those impact maternal employment. And that it really did matter where you lived in terms of whether you had access to schools, you had access to in-person learning. And this is complicated. We're not advocating in one way or another, but those who had access to in-person learning, mothers' employment suffered less. I'm also just going to point to the wonderful Katie Collins' book too, that as we're making these decisions around these things, if we don't need to start from scratch. She shows in an incredibly powerful book what motherhood looks like around the world, and how different kind of logics structure mother's employment. So we should think about these as critical resources to identify how to foster gender equality and work at home. Thank you. You can follow me here and find everything everywhere. And the only other thing I'll do is I'll drop this in the chat. If you are interested in our ESOS data, here's the link. I'll drop it in the chat if you want to look at it, but it's free. It's there. If this is of interest to you at all. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. So this is a really interesting presentation. I'm very impressed by this very interesting project. I think it is, so this project not only help us to better understand the problem, but also propose some policy implications, which is great. So do you have any questions? If you've got any questions, you can raise your hand. And okay, so we have a question from Mu Zheng, please.
Hi, Professor RUPPANNER. Hi. My name is Jing Mu. I'm a colleague of Sun Hu, working in the same department. And so I guess today I find this talk very interesting, of course, with lots of rich and exciting findings, and particularly as both a researcher on gender studies as well as a mother of two, I find both academically and personally related to many of those findings. I guess my question mainly can be categorized into three. And the first one is basically now I see that mothers tends to suffer more, both in comparison to fathers as well as to their childless counterparts. And so I guess I want to hear more of your thoughts on this potential role played by intensive parenting. And so the implication is that intensive parenting has a major social class dimension. Usually that those better educated parents, more economically resourced parents, it tends to emphasize the children's education more, and especially given the disruptions of school-based education, it is possible that this better educated parent, they might spend more time, and even fathers, on children's education in coping with this potential loss of training for their children. And so I want to hear about your thoughts about, probably you have some other findings at hand to further disentangle variations in the gender gap between fathers and mothers across education or across income and so on. And secondly, I also find this very interesting to see that how these racial minorities in the United States, the Blacks, Latinos, as well as single mothers, they tend to suffer more regarding their employment outcomes. And so I'm curious about these potential interactions, right? And so we know that many of those racial minorities tends to have higher like proportions living in incomplete families, like single parents, and as well as living in poverty or like a lower social class. I'm wondering that how these two may interactively influence this employment outcome. So for example, it is possible that with more like functional division of labor in these intact families, even among Blacks, and so the gender gap or this detriment to mothers' employment may not be as like significant, right? And so I also want to hear about like your thoughts on the interactions between those disadvantaging factors. And then thirdly, it's also interesting to see that Australia, in comparison to the US, tends to have more gender egalitarian outcomes, right? And so like, what are the possible reasons behind this? It's a little bit intriguing to me, because it seems to a researcher like doing research based in Asia, like Australia and United States tends to have like comparable cultural and policy backgrounds, right? And so what are your thoughts about the possible explanations? And also in a way, I guess that's laid a very solid foundation, like to expand the comparative studies to like other social contexts, especially for example, like in East Asia or in Singapore, there tends to be these divergent pathways for women's roles in the public and in the private sphere, that while they have the rights, like fuller rights to work, but still their roles as a mother, as a wife tends to be quite persistent and traditional. And so, yeah, I guess I just have those questions. I enjoy and learned a lot from the talk. Thank you.
Okay, first, wonderful to meet you, and thank you for the most delightful question. I'm going to take the last one. I'm going to go last. I'm going to mix them up in my response. Why Australia? Why gender equal? It's interesting because the United Nations puts these development report things up. And one of the interesting things pre-pandemic was the US and Australia had made the most gains in terms of gender equality, some of the most gains in gender equality around the world. So they were actually uniquely positioned perhaps for this moment towards gender equality, right? They had made the most gender equal progression over time and had the least slide back vis-a-vis other countries. I think why Australia had the most gender egalitarian outcomes, and this is a research question that would be interesting, in particular, taking some of the Southeast Asian countries to compare, is in part because I think they had some of the hardest, harshest, longest lockdowns in the world. So I think forcing people into the home for this extended period of time, where all of a sudden, like, it's not just 2 weeks, but it's a year, and everyone's in the house for a year, and you can't like kind of rebound to normal because the pandemic won't let you rebound to normal, and the government won't let you rebound back to normal. They keep putting you back in. That's what I think. This is speculation, right? I think that's why. I think it was like, yeah, sorry, I'm going to ramble about this, but I think couples being in houses or families being in houses for 2 years, isolated, made it very hard to not do the housework for many fathers, right? What would be interesting though would be to take the countries that had research project, take the countries that had harsh lockdowns and then look to see what happened. Like, you could actually test that, right? You could actually look and see with a cross-national sample and see like, did those countries have, did that actually, right? You could, because you could get the data on the lockdowns, you could get the data on that variability and see if I'm right. So interesting. I think that's an interesting paper. I don't think anyone's done it.
So it may not necessarily be a like genuine like shift in gender ideologies, right? But it's just a like coping strategy that when the work has to be done, someone has to do it, right?
Exactly. Like in the short term, it's like could be that intersection you said about like in the short term, maybe it's just coping, but in the long term, does it actually shift attitudes? And then that intersection,
I know.
Right? Like it might be that like, okay, for 2 weeks we can do this, but
just experience it, right? And then it's manageable, it's doable, right?
Like for 2 years?
That's very interesting. Yeah.
And then the intersection of like country differences and traditionalism is interesting too, right? It could be that lockdown times. So maybe in Singapore, it doesn't matter because there's more traditional allocations of gender roles, but maybe in Australia where there's an opening.
Right.
It's a research question. If anyone wants to do it, I'm here for it. But it could be quite interesting on that question.
Thank you.
The other thing around the intensive parenting, so I love it. The intensive parenting in the US, like we did a with Melissa Milk at University of Toronto. We haven't published any of this, but we collected interview data from 50 people in the US, 50 people in Australia, 50 people, 50 parents in Canada. And one of the interesting things that was coming through from our sample in Australia was like the lockdowns actually helped people slow down and dropped all the parents dropped all the busy activities that their kids were doing, and then it reintroduced others.
Yeah.
And so some of the work we're doing right now is how do we capture that and how do we capture mental loads, like the mental load piece. So I think what you're talking about is like a mental load question of like, my kid lost 2 years of school.
Right.
How am I mitigating that? How am I thinking about filling in those gaps? Or how am I
like maintain the say comparable level of knowledge accumulation or
Yes, and I think I think one of the way we were hearing, like we all slowed down, we did less, but then we had to do the homeschooling. And so if people have less demands in this direction, can they invest more heavily in their, I think there's an education piece. You're right. It's about professional work. Like all of it is true. And though I would be curious about the lingering effects of that, the way in which people are now thinking about it. Like, oh God, my kid was out of school for 2 years. Are they behind? Are they going to get into university? Are they developmental? You know, like that, all that worry. Yeah, right? Like all that worry work. And then the racial question, I'll just add that briefly. One of the things that came through, because quite clearly, is I think one of the things we have to remember in the US context was there was really limited or no social protection, and people of color were dying at higher rates than anybody else. And so for Black and Hispanic families, and they might not want to send their kids to school, right? I mean, it's like distrust of the medical system, distrust of the schools, high rates of death, no healthcare system. So I think everything you're saying is true, and there's compounding disadvantage. And then the other thing is there was a legit, valid protective mechanism too, right? That happened. So I'll pause it there, but
it's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So then we have another question from Adam. Please.
Hi, Adam.
Hello, thank you very much, Professor RUPPANNER. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's very informative, very interesting. I learned a lot from it. And I have questions about the suggestions, because at the end of the presentation, you talk about the Head Start program and how childcare support may help, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about the Head Start program? So what kind of childcare support it provides? And when you talk about the recommendations, so what kind, maybe there can be many different types of childcare support, right? Maybe, from daycare centers to in Asia, we have domestic workers living at home. So what kind of domestic childcare support you think that might help the couples more effectively? Because I have these questions because during COVID-19, the problem is a lot of this daycare support is gone, in a sense that maybe the city lockdown, then we cannot send the children to the daycare center. And for the domestic workers, we cannot have them coming in from other countries because of the travel ban. And so it is a very urgent question for many couples. So during COVID-19, what can we do? So I want to hear a little bit more on this. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I thought I was muted. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Zoom always interrupts everybody when you're like, super interesting question. So Head Start is basically a federal program that is both childcare and kind of has an educative piece, right? Because it's targeted towards low-income families. The interesting thing about Head Start in the US is it's limited in its that a lot of children go underserved, right? Even though it's supposed to be this kind of safety net, that there's a large number of large number of children who can't access Head Start even though they're eligible. And so it's something, but it's imperfect. When you ask about like, whoa, the pandemic was wild because it just wiped out childcare as an infrastructure, right? Like all of a sudden, yeah, you couldn't take your kid to the childcare center, but you also couldn't have someone come in and have help. And it was really risky to ask your parents to come in. So all these three ways, you know, the multiple or friends, like you can't ask friends or family, and then aging parents who often grandparents who often provide this really critical source of childcare for a lot of families are at the highest risk of death from COVID, right? So all of a sudden it all gets wiped out. I say I mean, I shouldn't be laughing about that. I mean, like, it's unbelievable, right? Like, and what are you supposed to do? Because you have now nothing to do, nothing to help. So I think I think if we take a lesson from that, the clear outcome is we often think of childcare as like child minding or babysitting or, you know, incidental. And it's like, wait a minute, childcare is actually a critical piece of infrastructure, much like schools, much like transport, much like whether you have access to a bus or a train or a internet. And the minute you remove that, it disappears. Like it has really widespread consequences. And so I'm talking about childcare, but we can think about, I often make these arguments about the care economy broadly. Childcare is only one piece of a care economy. There's aged care, you know, disability care, sick leave. And at some point, all of us will be called upon to care for someone we love, right? Friends, family, partners, children, relatives, whatever that looks like. So how do we think about an institutional support for care as opposed to care is what's done in the family and it's private and you take care of it however you want? It's not, it's actually a really integral thread of our economy and our health and our well-being. When you ask, like, what do you do? And you gave the option of like, there's multiple ways in which childcare or care can happen. But I think the three components that you need is it needs to be high quality, it needs to be reasonably low cost, affordable, and it needs to be accessible. And so as long as you're hitting those three things, I know that there's, yeah, as long as those three things are being met, then I think we have it doesn't matter what it looks like in terms of its manifestation, but then we have a good care system. And if those things disappear, then we have a bad care system. So they talk a lot about childcare deserts, right? Thinking about where are there gaps, care deserts. And that's about like no access, right? You don't have access, but you also think about cost of this. So I know I'm not giving you a direct answer. I know I'm giving you a little bit of an indirect answer, but I think your experience or your kind of view of it is saying like, whoa, this was really important was I think what happened in the pandemic. And so how do we use that window of insight to shore up our care economy, to shore up our caregiving net?
Yeah, thank you. I think, you know, the thing is that maybe, you know, it is the government when they decide the policy, they really have to recognize the importance of the care economy, and so I think that during the COVID-19, I think there are so many things that we can learn from the experience, and it seems that the policy at the very beginning was totally driven by minimizing the infection numbers, but forget ignore every other things. So actually a lot of people actually suffer from that, and mothers suffer from that because of the lack of support, and I think I think your research actually shows a very clear evidence that we need those things even in times of the pandemic and otherwise. It's not only about the infection, but it's also about a lot of people's life and well-being. So thank you. I think although you're not directly providing me an immediate answer, but I think we're getting there. Yeah, thank you.
Adam, you can follow. Thank you for the love on that.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we have another question from Wilson. Yeah, please.
Hi, Prof. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay. So I know it's 1 o'clock already, so I'm going to keep the questions short. But I'm going to ask the question this way, right? So you know, you propose that the solution is childcare, and you know, the reason for that is that women can go back to work and the gender gap will narrow, that being the case. And I also agree that, you know, childcare is a critical infrastructure, right? But we've also agreed that, you know, it can be unstable, right? Because sometimes the childcares would close down and so on. So actually, my question is simply this: is childcare the solution? Because the more fundamental solution to me, besides the infrastructure bit, is actually the shifting of gender ideologies for males, right? How do we change fathers' perception of family and work? That seems to me the more pertinent issue than putting in place a certain infrastructure. Because if you take away the infrastructure, what still remains the same are unequal gender ideologies that differentiate men and women. So to me, the more targeted or strategic solution is actually the shifting of male mindsets with regards to family and work.
Vincent, yes, and yes. Like, oh, sorry, Singho, did you want to say something?
No, it's fine. Yeah. So we just have another, so a statement from the Irene, and she also agree with Winston. Also want to make the point too.
Yeah, Irene agrees with me.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, I'm not saying it's the only solution. Like, it's not the only solution. It's not the silver bullet. You say childcare is not the silver bullet for gender inequality. And you're raising a really important point, which is like, part of this is about changing men's roles, right? Like changing men's roles, changing men's ability to step into care. I'll say two things that's quite interesting from the literature that everyone maybe already knows, and you've already read this, not my research, right? But there's clear evidence that like that transition into parenthood and that transition into heterosexual unions and then that transition into parenthood are two key pivot points towards gender inequality. And so I think there's a question about, one, why is that and what does that look like and how do you dismantle? And then two, how do you make sure that institutions allow men to care and allow women to work? Because the attitudinal change is there, right? Like Sarah Taboan has this research showing like attitudes have changed, right? Younger men want to be equal carers, want to be equal sharers. Scott Coltrane has this old book about fatherhood, new fatherhood, right? 1996, I mean, it's old, but like that there's a generational change between what fathers want. Young men today want to be egalitarian, they want to be equal carers, they want to be equal sharers, they want more time with their kids, right? Like they don't want to be forced into ideal worker norms. So it's a system that doesn't work for anybody. The whole system doesn't work for anybody. It's bad for men too. Like it's all bad for men.
Yeah,
it's bad for women,
for
it's bad for men.
It's bad for anyone who works, regardless of whether you're male or female.
And it's bad for you when people stay home, right? Sometimes too, right? Because it's incredibly stressful then too. So I think you're right. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I think you're absolutely right. It's changing, shifting. I think it's gender roles are changing, but institutions haven't caught up. And then also having some care infrastructure. I often say, sorry, I know we're at time, but I'll be very quick on this. I often say like it's about increasing choice, right? It's about like increasing choice so people can choose without restriction whether they want to stay at home and care for their kids or they want to work part-time or they want to work full-time. But if you have no childcare and you therefore have to stay home, that's not choice, that's structure.
Yeah.
Or if you want to stay home and you're a man, but you know that your boss is going to punish you and you're going to, that's not choice, that's structure.
So I'm thinking about the Australian case, these men are putting in the effort at home, but at the same time are becoming depressed.
Yeah.
It could be because their employers are not supportive.
Yeah.
Right.
That's interesting.
Right. So they are sort of at home doing the work, but, feeling conflicted because there is gender discrimination against men for, doing a childcare role. Yeah. So, but thanks so much for your responses. I really learned a lot, and congratulations again for such a wide comprehensive range of research projects. Really impressive. Thank you.
We were so anxious during the pandemic. All we did was read, write, and research. The other thing too, just keep an eye. I'll just say keep an eye on Australia in particular. I'll tell you more later on or whatever. But it's an interesting moment because we have a new government that just came in, and their whole platform is around gender and care. And so I think there'll be movement here, and whether it'll work or not, it'll be interesting to see what happens, what shifts, and what doesn't. So to be determined.
Yes, yeah, and we have another minor comment from Irene. Yeah, so basically, she statement argues that it is again so gender ideology, persistent traditional gender ideology in change is very, very important, crucial. But I think probably the best thing we can do right now is to change the policies, to change the structure and institutions. Yeah. Okay. So so if there are no other questions or comments, so it is will be the end of our presentation, our seminar. So please join me to thank Professor Leah RUPPANNER again for this very interesting project. I'm pretty sure that everyone should have learned a lot. And by the way, please continue to pay attention to our CFPR event. So in the next week, so in the 2nd September, there will be our first offline seminar, and it's by Professor Leah Tran. So the topic is the return of the dad bad dad, vulnerable legalities and parental maintenance law in Taiwan. Okay, and end of the presentation, please join me to thank Professor Leah again for this interesting presentation, and hope you have a nice weekend. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.